Chapter 2. The subject of freedom. One might say, without doing too much violence to the logic of Kant's text, that the subject of practical reason is, from the very beginning, a divided subject. Jacques-Alain Miller describes such a division as involving a choice where, on the one side, we find the life of pleasure, the love of life, of well-being, everything that belongs to the order of pathos or pathology proper, to the order of what we may feel. And, on the other side, the moral good as opposed to well-being, with the obligations it entails and is susceptible of entailing, that is, the negation of every pathos. Negation is not, perhaps, the most appropriate word for describing what is at stake in this subjective division, since we are not dealing with anything remotely like asceticism. Kant tells us, quote, "But this distinction of the principle of happiness from that of morality is not for this reason an opposition between them, and pure practical reason does not require that we should renounce the claims to happiness. It requires only that we take no account of them whenever duty is in question." End of quote. The relationship between happiness and duty is thus not that of a negation, but rather that of indifference. However, the most important point concerning the divided practical subject is the following one, which can also serve as our point of departure. The subject is divided by the fact that he has to choose between his pathos and his division. That is to say, the subject is not divided between the pathological and the pure. The alternative to pathological subjectivity is not pure or immaculate ethical subjectivity, but freedom or autonomy. This in turn leads us to the following provisional conclusion. The division characteristic of the subject of practical reason will be the division between the pathological subject and the divided subject. We will return to this point later. For now, let us examine how this subjective division is articulated in Kant's text. What freedom? Kant holds that, as human beings, we are part of nature, which means that we are entirely, internally and externally, subject to the laws of causality. Hence, our freedom is limited not only from the outside, but also from the inside. We are no more free in ourselves than we are in the world. Logically speaking, it is always possible to explain any act of the subject, that is, to establish its causes and motives, or expose its mechanism. Even if we doubt that it is really possible to take into account all the factors involved in an act, since human agents are far too complex for this to be possible, this is not sufficient to establish the existence of freedom. Such a humanist stance implies an essentially theological presumption. From a certain perspective, a God's eye view capable of embracing everything, human beings are just elaborate clockwork mechanisms, imagining that their ticking away is a result of their own decisions, nothing but their following their own rhythms. One of the fundamental theses of the second critique concerns the practical capacity of pure reason. However, the proposition according to which pure reason can in itself be practical, and the fact that Kant founds freedom and the moral law on pure reason do not imply that freedom is to be based on a retreat to the interior. We will therefore not be forced to look for the purity of pure reason in the depths of the soul, as opposed to out there in the immoral world. Kant does not try simply to encourage us to act according to our deepest convictions, as does the contemporary ideology, advocating that we heed our authentic inclinations and rediscover our true selves. Instead, the procedure of the critique is based on Kant's recognition of the fact that our inclinations and our deepest convictions are radically pathological, that they belong to the domain of heteronomy. The defining feature of a free act, on the contrary, is precisely that it is entirely foreign to the subject's inclinations. Of course, freedom does not mean simply doing whatever one wants, even for common sense rationality, since this may involve harming others. But for Kant, the problem lies somewhere else entirely. If it makes no sense to say that we do whatever we want, and thus are free, this is only because it is impossible to prove that we are in fact free in our wanting, that no empirical representation really affects our will. We might thus say that the self of practical reason does not really live at home, and that therefore the foundation of the subject's freedom can reside only in some foreign body. The subject gains access to freedom only insofar as she finds herself a stranger in her own house. And this aspect of Kant's argument has provoked genuine indignation and unease among certain critics. Kant's requirements, these critics say, conflict with our deepest personal convictions. Kantian ethics is essentially an ethics of alienation, since it forces us to reject that which is most truly ours, and to submit ourselves to an abstract principle that takes neither love nor sympathy into account. Some critics have even considered the requirement of acting exclusively for the sake of duty repugnant. These objections clearly show that Kant has struck the nerve of the problem of ethics, the question of the specifically ethical jouissance and of its domestication in love for one's neighbor. For some critics, what is hardest to take in Kant's move is precisely that Kant takes this foreign body as that which is most truly ours, and founds on it the autonomy and freedom of the subject. Psychological freedom, Kant's term, cannot be a solution to the problem of the possibility of freedom, since it is just another name for determinism. If one tries to found freedom on the fact that the causes of a subject's actions are internal, that representations, desires, aspirations, and inclinations function as causes, one will never find anything resembling freedom. Instead, one will find that freedom itself is reduced back to psychological causality, the necessary connection of psychological phenomena in time. In our attempt to understand the concept of freedom which lies at the foundation of the moral law, Kant insists it is not a question of whether the causality determined by the laws of nature has its necessity through determining grounds lying inside or outside the subject. Nor is it a question of whether such grounds, if they happen to lie within the subject, consist of instincts or of motives that are the product of reason. Quote, "They are nonetheless determining grounds of the causality of a being, so far as his existence is determinable in time. As such, this being is under necessitating conditions of past time, which are no longer in his power when he acts." End of quote. Here, there is no room for freedom. If the freedom of the will were nothing but such a psychological freedom, concludes Kant, it would in essence be no more freedom than the freedom of a spinning top, which, once wound up and set in motion, also moves of its own accord. How then, and on what basis, can freedom be accounted for? The answer to this question is quite surprising and turns, to a great extent, around the notion of guilt. Before examining this argument linking freedom to guilt, developed in the critical elucidation of the analytic of pure practical reason, it must be stressed that this is not the argument we find in the traditional interpretation of Kant's concept of freedom, which focuses on the chapter of the Critique of Practical Reason entitled "Of the Deduction of the Principles of Pure Practical Reason." The official chapter devoted to the foundation or deduction of freedom. Thus, in taking as our starting point the chapter on critical elucidation of the analytic of pure practical reason, we do not follow the standard reading. This is not, however, without Kant's blessing, for in the preface, where he speaks on the difficulty of the concept of freedom, he begs the reader not to run lightly through what is said about this concept at the end of the analytic.